Welcome to the speaker, Imran.
Under the Hoku system implemented by the CCCP, Chinese citizens living in rural regions like, for example, Chiling and Hunan are disallowed from moving and migrating to city areas like, for example, Shanghai and Beijing to capitalize on the economic advantages there. For the simple reason, because when China first started its industrialization under Deng Xiaoping, it established special economic zones in the areas that we know as Beijing and Shanghai, and they didn't want these areas to be overpopulated, thinking that would harm their economic chances. We don't think the economic rationale exists anymore. Because what happens when people do want to move to these areas is that they're either forcibly returned back home, they're either fined, or like they are basically sent to prison. What we're going to expect, moreover, when they are actually allowed to go to these regions, they're not given basic rights. For example, they can't set up businesses, they're not allowed the property rights to own any form of property, and we think there's essential prerequisites that's needed to set up businesses for these individuals and to partake in the economic miracle that is China. What we're going to do, Mr. Speaker, is quite simple. We're going to tear down these Hoku walls. We're going to slowly, in stages and systematically, open up the ability for these areas to take up more economic migrants from the rural areas. And correspondingly, what we're going to do is that we're going to get the Chinese government to build areas, housing areas and accommodation to suit that slowly by increasing people from the rural areas transferring and migrating into areas like Beijing and Shanghai. We think they have the largest to do this. Moreover, we're going to remove all the prohibitions that have been set up earlier. We're going to allow these people to set up businesses. We're going to allow these people to take out loans to set up these businesses as well. And we're going to allow these people to own their own property. What I'm going to talk to you today, Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, we're going to have a chat about why this is principally fundamental for the people of China. And secondly, we're going to talk about why this is the best option for the economic and social progress of China. So the first, right, and I know Chinese people really well, so this is going to be really fun. The first point, right, the principle, why this is fundamentally important, and there are two primary reasons. The first, Mr. Speaker, is that we think that the right to economic participation is the basis of the legitimacy of the Chinese state as we see it. Because Deng Xiaoping's primary rationale was simple, right? That to be rich is to be glorious. And what he was able to do, right, to push this particular form of communism was to let people believe that they can partake in the economic miracle and the economic progress that China will undergo. So what basically is happening right now with their policy is that they're being unfair. Because what you do is that you create a slave class where people are prevented from moving to these areas like Beijing and Shanghai to capitalize on the comparative advantages that lie in these areas that were previously special economic zones. Things, for example, greater visibility that will allow them, when they set up businesses and when they try to break up into some kind of entrepreneurship project. And what we think is particularly important as well is that what you do when you put through this policy is that you lock people into their geographies, you lock people into a specific class, and you lock people into a specific condition. And we think what's happening here is that you lock them to things, like, for example, hard labor or jobs that only open up to certain people within these rural regions that we think are particularly harmful to the ability of these individuals who have the lot to improve themselves and move themselves to these bigger regions. What is particularly heinous is that the state is complicit in the kind of harms that these people undergo in their daily lives. We think that the birth lottery determines where we end up in China, and we think that issues of happenstance and chance are very poor reason to lock these people into their plight. Right? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we think this is especially important because even though when these people are allowed to move into regions like Beijing and Shanghai, they are blighted by the feeling of impermanence, right? Because they can't own property, they can't set up businesses. And we think giving them these rights is fundamentally important because it gives them the corollary protection that comes with these rights. When I own property and when I have the right to own property, I correspondingly have the rights to protect that property and not easily allow anybody, including the state, to just take it away from me. And we think this feeling of permanence is especially important to Chinese people, and they have a right to do it. Now we move on to the second idea, right? Why this is the best for the economic and social progress of China, and this is going to blow your mind away. We have three levels for this. The first, we think that the biggest problem affecting China right now is the issue of social inequality. That's why we constantly see people leading protests or social unrest in the streets of Chiling and Hunan. And why is this so? Because we think that when people see the very drastic social inequality that exists, right, between people who live in Beijing, who are far more cosmopolitan and far more enriched, and the people who live in these rural regions, what develops is the politics of envy. We don't think this is exclusive just in China. We've seen it happen before in Iran in 1979 against the Shah, because even though Iran was progressing quite at a fast rate, right, the kind of economic progress didn't trickle down equally to the people who lived in that region, and that led to the kind of politics that we see. So what happens when you remove this particular policy is that you allow them to partake in the economic miracle that is China, and you allow them to try and fight for themselves within the open market that exists. And we think this is especially important because to them now, they can clearly see that the state is not explicitly trying to stop them from partaking in this the economic participation, and they can no longer blame the state for them not being able to progress the way they want to. That's why we think it's going to be a solution to the kind of social protest that goes on in the streets. Even if we do agree and we concede that their quality of life might not be as good as you like, because it might slowly be lowered, we think it's better because the kind of equitable growth that proliferates and pervades the rest of China is increasingly better if you weigh it up against the minimal decrease in standard of living that they encounter in these regions. We don't think that they're going to have the natural incentive to do this because to the CCCP, why they can't put through these measures on their own is for a simple reason. Because they happen to go under the political delusions that only need to protect their important constituent classes in the coastal regions like Shanghai and in the big regions like Beijing. Now, recognizing that they are not compelled or moved by any natural incentive to pander to the other classes of people who live in the outskirts or in the rural regions of China. So we don't think it's going to come naturally, and we think we need to come in, intervene and force it through. The second reason why this is important, because we understand one thing about the Chinese economic model of growth. Because they are built primarily on industrialization, they are primarily built on the idea of entrepreneurship done by the middle class Chinese businessmen that exist in these Chinese societies. So what we propose and what we suggest on this side is that we want to remove the walls that prohibit people moving from rural areas to the main urban areas and allow them to start off even as laborers if you may have. Because what we think is going to happen here is that even though they start off as laborers, what happens in these Chinese societies is that they build up the kind of economic largesse that's needed for them to start out small businesses on the side. A phenomenon that we see across all Chinese cities and all Chinese societies, where even though they work as laborers in the day, they have their own small businesses at night, which tries to keep them afloat and in living against the kind of harsh terrain of urban life in Beijing and Shanghai. And we think this is important, because what you can see from other areas, like for example Southeast Asia, is that even though a lot of them started off as laborers, as they push themselves upwards and become more economically mobile, they start more businesses and they become entrepreneurs in their own right, pushing the economic growth of these countries to a level that we think is good for China as well. Thirdly, we think this is important in solving the kind of social problems that's afflicting China as well. Because the largest problem with China right now is that people living in the cosmopolitan people living in the bigger cities see the people living in the rural areas suffering from things, for example, forced abortions as the others. There is no interaction or connection between the two because they can't and they have not directly interacted with these people in these main regions. So what we're going to do is that we're going to break that disconnect and force them to integrate and force them to understand the plights and make them realize that they're no different from the others as well. What we suggest on this side is that we are going to rally the center-left intelligentsia to realize the personal plight suffered by these people, and we're going to rally them to pressurize the Chinese government to understand what these people are suffering from and to push through the kind of reforms that we need. And we think this is going to be successful because these, like I said earlier, are the important constituent blocks that the Chinese government mainly pander to. Because, Mr. Speaker, we realize the true problems affecting China, because we realize the whole system doesn't make sense anymore. This important motion must stand.
Principally, within this debate, we believe that China is a country which is based upon the premise of collective rights over individual rights, and how those collective rights lead to not only the prosperity of the country, but actually to quality of life risings for the population as a whole. That's what we stand for. So we totally support the status quo of government like ownership over land, being able to dictate where people live, and restricting migration. So, 2 points of rebuttal before I go to substantive. Firstly, on this principle of right to economic participation, and secondly, how do we fix social inequality in China? So, what we heard is that China principally is all about being able to rise up, and we don't think that's the case. We think China is about building the prosperity of the country where everyone fulfills their parts, and part of that is some people living in rural areas, or some people taking some concessions so the prosperity of the country overall can increase. That's how we've seen China being one of the most successful countries of this century through this principle. But moreover, we think most importantly, as I alluded to earlier, the quality of life is actually improved this way. When we have a concentration in cities, the service provision that the government is able to give through its collective rights principle is minimised. We think it's done best under the status quo, which I'll talk about later. But next to social inequality, and let's look at their solution as to how they wanted to fix social inequality. Firstly, they wanted to move unskilled farmers that had been there to of decades into cities where they'd magically be able to run businesses without like the skills that needed for businesses in the first place. And that was acknowledged by their latest substantive that said that these people would be labourers. Let's look at what they'll have if they're labourers. They're going to be working in factories where it is known in China that the suicide rates in these factories are through the roof. They're not going to be able to like work their way up into businesses. They're going to be in really bad jobs where they have to work constant jobs. At least in their farming places, they can run their farm, they can be prosperous in that way, and they can access the state services that the state can give them. We think that's important. But if they do have the magic business skills that you want to do that, businesses can exist in rural areas as well. So we're happy for rural areas to expand rather than trying to concentrate it all in the city, which goes against economic principles. But next we heard this idea of social inequality, and we think social inequality is made much worse when you remove the poorest of the poor and put them into rich areas. Like, we don't think that they're suddenly going to look at the underclass and feel sorry for them. If you look at any other country, when you have a high concentration of rich and poor people, there's even more like hatred towards each other, mostly because the poor people do stuff like crime and like linger around, which people don't like, and the rich resent them even more and they don't want to help them. Or we think that you can see that in India and Brazil, where you have slums and favelas next to rich housing. It doesn't work there. But then we heard lastly that they'd be empowered because the state wouldn't be limited them anymore. We think they conceded there would be low living standards, but we think they would not be empowered by the state because they would get less access to the state services when they move here, which we think would be worse. So, on to my first point about principally what is the role of the Chinese government in their state. And we think the Chinese population have conceded that to the state they want to give away some of their rights in response to having a better quality of life and the government providing them. We think China is a really unique country in the way that their state provides them because of that. And we think they have done that, we think they have increased prosperity and quality of living. But moreover, we saw that recently when there was discussions towards more democracy and more privatisation, the majority of Chinese people didn't want this. They agreed that they wanted collective ownership and their government to be able to act the way they do because they think it's for their country, the riches that they did get. We think that the way that the collective government and Politburo works is they aggregate together so they can provide the best quality of living through state services. So we think under the status quo, the quality of life is much more better. We think practically, you just can't suddenly move large amounts of population into the city because the way China is, we think you need China to be able to control where people are. One, we think China is a unique country in the way that they provide education, insurance and superannuation because there are no private enterprises that can do this. We see overwhelming state enterprise in China. They need to plan where their citizens are so they can effectively give these services out. The population in China is so high, but moreover the state has to provide all of their services. So we think practically the government needs to be able to control this to improve the quality of life for these people. And we think for example, moreover, this is seen at the moment. We see the fact that the government is trying to improve transportation. They're trying to move education. But you undermine all of that when you move the concentration of people around. We think it's best for them to be able to control where they are. But secondly, we think it's important for the prosperity of China to be able to choose to relocate people when they need to build hydraulic dams or any infrastructure projects that help the whole country enable them to move on. So secondly, quality of life. We think within the world there is a perception that living in the city is better for you, and especially that exists in China because of the technology differences and relevant inequalities. So we think as they've set up, a lot of people will see it as desirable to move. We think that perception is incorrect and that people overwhelmingly have a better quality of life back in the rural areas. Why is that? A number of reasons. Firstly, housing, which goes against their model. We see in Shanghai the average cost of a very average flat is $500,000. So we wonder how they're suddenly going to magically build apartments for all the people that they're trying to relocate. So we think this will make it worse because there'll be less land and less space, and it will increase the inflation that currently China has a massive problem which we think will be bad. What will that lead to? It means people will live in slums, they'll live in favelas, they're going to live in really dire living conditions that the government won't be able to address. There are so many people in China that will be moving, they won't be able to give sufficient housing. So we think it removes housing quality for the people who are already in the cities, but also for the people who are trying to move. Secondly, the cost of living. China heavily relies on the southwest rural areas such as Sichuan and Guangxi to produce a lot of their farming goods to feed the rest of China. When you encourage those farming populations to move to the city, the cost of living rises through the roof because you no longer have the Chinese people producing their own food to feed those own people. So we think that hurts the people who you want to help the most, because the people who have then moved to the city for the poorest won't be able to afford food. But lastly, in terms of the environment, we currently see China really trying to manage the pollution there. And we see like one of the biggest problems is congestion, where there's 1,000 new cars every day in China. We think the Chinese government finds it very hard to address pollution when they can't even manage where their people are and what kind of pollution and congestion that is going on. So lastly, to exploitation. We think we saw a trial of the opposition's model happen in the Chongqing region when they allowed temporarily some migration and house privatisation. We thought a huge amount of exploitation happened there. What did happen? We saw private corporations and state-owned enterprises buying the land off the rural people, and they got nothing out of it. We saw a large amount of land being taken up by corporations who wanted to expand rather than giving houses and land to the people who need it most. Moreover, the government was highly corrupt in these transactions, which we think is a reality, where 15% of the transaction was kept by the government, so they had an incentive to actually profit off there. We think under the current system, where migration is restricted and people have a hereditary right to some land, they have that land and they're able to have a decent quality of living there. Because we protect the Chinese people, because we protect their quality of life, but moreover, because we allow prosperity to continue, we're very proud to oppose.
It is particularly ironic that that's how the House can come up and tell us the collective right is more important over the individual right. What is so collective when we ban people, when we restrict people from the rural areas from travelling and enjoying the economic prospects of the advancement in the cities? We think that is not collective right, that particularly divides these areas. We don't want people have to collect this advancement. Let's talk about the first point of contention, the whole idea that the collective right policy has given the progress to China and people support it. Now, on the very first level, we don't think that this was the policy the government campaigned on. Imran came up here and beautifully told you that the point here is about right to economic advancement. The premise of Chinese policies are basically the promise to give you some form of stability and some form of sustenance. We think this policy undermines that right. But on the second level, we think that this policy, even if this is the policy, we think the day is long gone, but you can depend on this for economic advancement. There is a great impetus and a need to push forward different policies, and that's where we think our policy works, because it provides that impetus. I'll go into that in my substantive later, but the impetus is in enforcing government to allow these entrepreneurs to come into the cities and to build and develop greater businesses, and also to deal with this migration, to develop the rural areas as well, to make sure that these cities or these rural areas have the infrastructure such that people don't want to move out. So those are the ways that we push economic advancement in these areas. The second thing they told us is people subscribe to this collective advancement, therefore they won't support this policy. Because the only people who subscribe to this are those who have benefited from the previous policies. You see, the villagers in a lot of these rural villages don't support this kind of policy. They want for the removal of the coal policy. This is something Robin told me to correct Imran. Now, on the second level, how does the state achieve any sort of advancement or of advancement? They told us that it's impossible, that the cities are already overflowing, it will create to more slums and bad living standards. We think on the very first level, Imran told you in his policy about the development of a lot of these areas. We want to improve these living conditions. We understand that, especially in places like India, for example, these are social problems that will exist, but we think they are fixable. There's no need to restrict people geographically from economic advancement. On the second level, we say this is not an issue of limited resources, but of political will. Can the government do it? Yes, they can. Does the government want to do it because it doesn't see the rural migration as something beneficial to them? No, they won't. They don't think that it's politically beneficial for them. We think that's problematic because it's precisely these rural migrants that manage to develop the economic landscape in these cities. But on the second level, we think that it's even more miserable to stay in villages. It's even more miserable when you force these villagers to go into things like prostitution to make money. They tell you that it's economic advancement. People can start farming and making money. We think that's absolute bollocks. Nobody makes money in the villages anymore because we are moving towards a higher level of industrialization. No one stays in the villages and make money. They're all seeking to make more money in the city. We don't see why that's a worse standard of living. I would rather stay in a slum than remain hungry in the village. On the second level, they then told us it's impossible for the state to achieve it because, you know what, we're already maxing out the number of cars, so we're already maxing out on space. Well, I believe boundaries are flexible. Let's expand the city if we want to. Let's expand the amount of industrialization. We don't see that as a problem. On the second level, they then told us, look, what would these villagers do? And they had 3 or 4 different problems to that. They told us that these villagers are uneducated. They will just serve as odd job laborers. We think perhaps that may be a problem that severely underestimates the capability of an uneducated individual to develop and to be entrepreneurial in terms of businesses. But even if we assume that, we think that it's precisely the long-term benefit that can be achieved. So education of these individuals, educating their kids, for example, providing them the prospect of long-term development that's extremely important and we think that's beneficial to China as a whole. Well, the second level, they then told us enhance the villages because it leads to high rates of suicides and bad treatment by employers. We think it's precisely the status quo where they're illegal, they're ill-treated to the extent that they do commit suicide. It's not as if the rates of suicide in villages are any lower than the cities. We think it's even higher precisely because they cannot feed their children and their families. They feel embarrassed or they want to cash in on insurance policies. They commit suicide as well. We think the only way to deal with this is to legalize it and to allow for these people to seek redress from the state. On the last level, they say, well, we can stay in the village and expect governments to improve it. We think that the villagers have stayed in the village for long enough and hope and pray for governments to improve it. But the reason why governments see no real need to improve these villages is because there is no political will. They see these villages as trouble, and the only need to draw the line, the clear divide between the city and the village is precisely because they don't want them to flow in and disrupt the economic balance. They then told us these guys cause a lot of social problems. Well, we think there are bigger social problems now, like people dying in the villages, like, unhappiness that's massive throughout these villages as well. Let's try and solve those too. There will always be a tension between the established middle class in the cities and the rural villages. But just as, let's use the example of in India, where the middle class, when they finally managed to engage with and interact with a lot of these villagers, managed to understand and start lobbying for the plight of a lot of these individuals, people who are lobbying for the removal of farms in India aren't the village, aren't the poor people themselves, but the middle class. We think that the Chinese people will be fully capable of evolving to that status as well. Let's talk about the policy benefits of China in the long run. We think on the very first level, it allows for the development of greater entrepreneurship. We think on the very first level, China is very reliant on the brains of a narrow group of people. It's achieved its economic progress not because there's great farming in the villages, but precisely because Shanghai and a lot of these city centers managed to develop itself and push towards using its entrepreneurial edge. We think if the eventual goal is to challenge countries like India and the United States, to do that, there is a need to move away from low-skill manufacturing into harnessing the talent of more of the individuals that have the entrepreneurial edge. For this push towards a more entrepreneurial society, there's a need to tap into the existing state infrastructure, and that's concentrated in the cities. So that's why the house will tell you that this infrastructure can exist in the villages. We know at the very first level that's not happening, but at the second level it takes at least a good 20 to 30 years to develop that. We don't think China has that kind of time. They need to start pushing these villages into the cities now. But on the second level, we think the inaccessibility of the city centre leads to 2 big problems. First of all, they lack a competitive edge. The entrepreneurial edge and the higher end businesses can only develop if a lot of these individuals are allowed to come into the cities and set up competitive businesses or new businesses to begin with. But on the second level, we think we lose a lot of the brains of these people, either because they don't get the opportunity to set up their businesses or they move to other places to explore other business opportunities. So what does our policy do? Our policy does 2 things. First of all, it gives them the economic opportunity that allows for the outward expansion of the economic landscape in China. I think that's extremely important because it benefits both the Chinese people and China as a whole when it allows for a greater inflow of money and greater ideas to be explored. But the second thing that this policy does is it forces development of rural areas. We think there's a greater incentive now for the Chinese government to develop and expand either the city centre or the rural areas because they want to prevent the flooding of the city centre. We think right now there's no compelling need, as I told you earlier, because the political base comes from the city, the political support incentive to develop the fringes of society. We think now, because of this development, because of this policy, you encourage greater development of these other areas. It benefits both Chinese as a whole and China as a whole in terms of economic opportunities. Let's enforce this policy for China, for the Chinese, and for Robin. We are proud.
It is incumbent on the Chinese government to provide the best quality of life for as many citizens as it possibly can. And their model did nothing to substantiate how that happened. The millions of rice farmers moving into Beijing would not become high industry, high-tech businessmen that they wanted to talk about. We showed you how we look after the best interests of the majority of the Chinese people. 2 points in substantive. Firstly, how they entrench the gender gap. Secondly, how they harm economic liberalism in China. Before that, 2 questions of rebuttal. Firstly, how do we most effectively and equally balance the rights of Chinese citizens? Secondly, progression, both social and economic. So firstly, we heard that the entire legitimacy of the Chinese regime was built around your right to participate in the economic miracle. That we were locking people into a lottery and that only wealthy people consented to the system. Firstly, communism is built around wealth transfer. It is not built around the idea that you have equal participation in a capitalist system. So that is principally inconsistent there. Secondly, we told you that people in these villages implicitly consent to this system. No response from them. They implicitly consent by not agitating for more change. They consent by having a system of wealth transfer that takes wealth from the rich east coast of Beijing, Shanghai, business centres, and transferring that wealth in the form of welfare programs, education, hospitals to the centre of the country, which could never have those kind of services under a capitalist system. Firstly, on this, we told you that lotteries are always going to be an issue regardless of which society you're in, and they did not go sufficiently far enough to addressing that problem. But even if this wasn't how we best balanced the rights of Chinese citizens, we told you that the exploitation that occurs from these citizens when state-owned enterprises are able to effectively force them off their land and lock them into a labouring system which they cannot escape from, that is a worse harm. So even if we lose out on protecting everybody equally, we protect these people more. No response at second, try again at third. Secondly, how do we best get social progression in and economic progression? We heard that there was social inequality, politics of envy, and that the CCP would only protect its core constituents. Okay, firstly, you still don't fix social inequality. Presumably there are still going to be some people out there, so the politics of envy will remain the same. But even if you did fix everything, that kind of unrest and agitation is the best thing for getting better services for those regions, right? If the CCP only protects its core, then they are necessarily going to feel thwarted by you imposing this policy against them. We think that means there is less incentive for them to continue providing services to the village. On social problems, we told you that rich people do not like being forced to be next to poor people because, whether it is accurate or not, there is a perception that poor people cause crime. There is a perception that they are unemployed. There is a perception that they do all kinds of social ills, and they don't fix that because that messaging effect isn't strong enough to overcome generations of prejudice here. And even if it was, right, you lose political capital to agitate for better conditions in these poor regions, right? The idea is, oh great, they've lost the rule of huku now. They can move into the cities and just be like us. Nothing is bad in these areas. You have made your first move, you have shot your quiver, and lost the political ability to change the situation quickly. But we can fix these villages too, right? It isn't incompatible under our model to say that we would be happy to see more spending here. We heard that you need economic advancement by getting more people in the cities here, right? You need these people to become high tech. Right. A rice farmer does not become a computer high-end business manufacturer by suddenly moving to Shanghai. And it was fallacious to suggest that was going to happen. But secondly, let's look at the kinds of economic calculus the Chinese government has made. The reason there is a one-child policy in the cities and a two-child policy elsewhere is because they don't need more people in the cities. Because they have trouble providing people in the cities already with services, right? You don't fix that problem. China doesn't need these people suddenly moving into Beijing and Shanghai. What they need is more domestic consumption, right? You incentivize that by having these people stay in their villages there. We then were told, flippantly, assertively, that this wasn't a question of limited resources. Bullshit, it's not. China can't feed its own population under the status quo. That's why they buy land in Africa and exploit Africans. If you start taking people away from like the agribusiness sector, then you just incentivize that more, right? They can't feed their people now, you'll be exploiting even more people under your model there. Okay, I think I've adequately hit that. So first, to answer how this entrenches the gender gap, right? Under the status quo, like there's a growing gender divide. There are 20 million more men than there are women in China, and that's a lot, right? So under the rural hukou, you're allowed 2 children, and under the city one, you're allowed 1. Why is that? There are too many people in the city. Seems pretty obvious, right? So firstly, if there is the massive influx of people that they wanted to assert would like occur under their model, right? That means there's hugely more pressures on those cities and the provision of families. What does that mean? It means you select the fetus that you have. It means you selectively abort female fetuses. We see this under the status quo, and it only gets worse under their model. So why do they abort female fetuses? The first is they need high-powered earners to support their parents. That inherently suggests men, right? Particularly in new families that don't have the kinds of connection in like the previous rural land plots that they used to have. They are going into a new environment in which they are like less economically equipped and less able to compete against people that have been there for generations. So they inherently feel that they need to have the best ability to get earning power. Secondly, there is a cultural norm that favours having male over female children. Like we see, fundamentally, that when you get married, like your wife moves in with your parents, right, rather than the other way around. That means there's more support of the male's family. So there's an incentive on parents to have male children over there. But there's also this cultural norm of like the little prince, like the pampered Chinese like single child. This means, particularly in the case of rural workers, right? Because in agri-labour sectors, there is like an inability to transition from low you need male children because they are more effectively able to generate economic prosperity. That doesn't necessarily hold true in the city, but the perception that it does is what selects there. Why is this bad? It's bad for women firstly. Like the first is obviously that girl fetuses are aborted and it's prima facie pretty bad for them. But the second is that when you have drastically fewer women than men, women become increasingly objectified. They are viewed as more of a commodity and that change the calculus from one of value to one of them being a good that only a select few have access to. So the norm of treating women becomes worse. Secondly, it's bad for men, particularly like the culture of bare branches. Young Chinese men who know that they are incapable and like unlikely to attract a wife over the long term. These men become socially ostracized inside Chinese culture, so it's bad for them there. Thirdly, it's bad for society because those bare branches have a much higher proportion to commit crime because it's very unlikely that you derive any kind of meaningful quality of life when you feel that you've been condemned to spend your life alone and unloved. So, why do we change this? Because a rural hukou allows for more children. It removes the kind of incentive for you to select your fetus to be a man. It removes the idea that you absolutely have to have this male fetus because you're allowed to have 2, right? You can have your man and your woman. When you are in the city and constrained to only one choice, the harm that would come from making the wrong choice of selecting a female fetus over a man means you will always err on the side of caution and you will always select a male fetus. If the drastic numbers of families are going to move, we're going to see millions and millions more men than women being born, and we're going to see this gender divide permanently entrenched beyond the point where we can rectify it. Secondly, how is economic liberalisation harmed? This weakens the China model of capitalism, right? It shows the central state role isn't legitimate inside society. It weakens the state's role in providing things. It incentivizes the CCP to crack down in other areas because the loss of base you get from this in saying that the state is not equipped to determine where you are best placed to bring economic gains to China means you have an incentive to reinforce that image in other areas of policy. Firstly, it removes your ability and even your desire to transfer wealth to these villages. But secondly, we think it's bad for the middle class when the CCP is incentivized to restrict economic activity in other areas. Because we protect all Chinese citizens, and even if we don't, we protect the most vulnerable we oppose.
Okay, it's about time someone actually pronounce their words in this debate. I'm going to look at two things. Firstly, I'll talk about Chinese rights. Do the Chinese people deserve rights? And what kind of rights do they deserve? Secondly, I'm going to look at the issue of the consequences of that particular policy on these individual workers as well as Chinese development as a whole, and women as well. We all want to protect Chinese women. So first and foremost, the issue of Chinese rights. And the premise of their case is that China has all this Orientalist vision that Chinese people only care about collective rights because Chinese people only care about money. Well, the last
part is true, at least, but we don't think the first part is true. This idea of collectivism, meaning that all rights, even though the right to economic opportunity is being sacrificed, is just blatantly untrue. On the first level, we've told you, the Chinese people have by and large consented to a degree of collectivity insofar as political rights and the right to free speech is concerned. That is why they are the one-party dictatorship. But that is because they know that the CCP has guaranteed the people a degree of economic progress that extends to all of China, to all Chinese citizens, not just to some by virtue of the birth logic. And they have never engaged what Iman said. They create inequality by ensuring these people are locked into the geography into which they are born. Even if we don't talk about materialism here, the impingement on their dignity is immense. And their response to this is that, firstly, communism is based on wealth transfer. Bollocks, the CCP isn't that communist anymore. It's a nationalist party that aims to bring Secondly, they say the people in the villages consent. Utter bollocks. On the first level, the reason why there's so many protests and unhappiness in places like Guilin is because they are unhappy with their lot. That's why there's a politics of envy in the first place. And secondly, their consent is not being taken through organic means, it's being taken through military fiat, ladies and gentlemen, through the police clamping down on them and sending them to dark rooms and prisons where they protest. That is consent, ladies and gentlemen. They should move to China and give us a place in Australia. Even if we agree that a degree of collectivity is needed here, they have never once addressed the issue of those in the middle, those who actually move to the cities as day laborers, ladies and gentlemen. How exactly will their welfare be taken care of? They say there will be exploitation under our policy. We say exploitation under their is even worse because of this lack of permanence for these particular day laborers. Because their employers, the moment their employers sack them, for instance, they have no property, they have no bank account, they have no reason to stay in Shanghai and Beijing anymore. That sense of impermanence is worse for their dignity. What we do here is ensure when they move to the cities, they can procure the means to ensure and defend themselves within the context of Chinese cities by getting property, by getting bank loans, and by putting down roots in these particular areas. And lastly, we just blatantly disagree that China must always be collective. Like there's a huge strain of Chinese political thought promulgated by people like Jiang Zemin, by Ling Tong previously, and thousands of others that wants greater liberalization, that wants to move towards greater individual rights, ladies and gentlemen. And we are very happy to stand behind that school of the Chinese leadership in opposition to people like Xi Jinping. That is the vision of China that we are going to stand for. Let's move on to the second issue, the issue of the consequences of our political policy. Firstly, he said it weakens the gender gap, and he gave us this long lecture about how Chinese people and chauvinists. And surprisingly enough, we actually do agree, ladies and gentlemen. But the problem here is that their policy doesn't solve a thing. On the first level, it is just bollocks to say villagers are allowed 2 kids, right? The only people, and I actually know this, the only people in China who actually allow 2 kids are people in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Muslims in general, because they don't want to place those particular people. Of the Han-Chinese living places like Guilin are still only allowed 1 kid, ladies and gentlemen. That is absolutely horrible. So the problem with that particular policy, contrary to what they say, is that when you lock these people into staying as farmers, they will inherently favor men, because men can work better on farms, ladies and gentlemen. They want 2 boys because they want 2 boys working on a particular farm. At least our specific policy, even doctors can move to cities to work in factories, to work as maids, and eventually advance their earnings and send their remittances to the particular cities. So our policy actually improves this particular issue of the gender gap. The next issue here is the issue of overall development within China, and they claim that the lack of central state control will actually worsen the situation here. On the first level, this is something Sa talked about that we don't think they adequately rebutted. In the status quo now, there is no political will on the part of the CCP to put the same amount of resources into places like Guilin that they do in Shanghai and Guangdong, for the simple reason that the CCP uses this very tool to bifurcate the interest and the connection between the cities and the rural areas. They understand that people in the rural areas are the biggest threat to their power, and that's why because of that they want to make sure that their connection to the cities will forever be broken. That is why we think that once these people move to the cities, once their interests become material to the power of the Chinese Communist Party, that is the only circumstances where they can actually work towards building these rural areas and building up this particular area. So our policy actually incentivizes the CCP to actually industrialize the rural areas as well, because historically speaking, the CCP must feel threatened and their power must be threatened before they actually work towards improving their particular law. Secondly, they have never figured out the issue of creating a greater connection between the entrepreneurial class and the middle class and the people in the rural class as well, ladies and gentlemen. We agree, but when they first move to these cities, there will be a degree of initial tension. intervention, but we think in the long run, with greater intervention, once these people have advanced themselves, and once the more open-minded of them have looked at these people and their plights in this city, that is where people like intellectuals in Tsinghua University and Beijing University will look at their plight and work with them to improve their plight. Such very example of India, comparing between India and China, is opposite here. Right? Even though India has tensions between different classes, what we see now in India is a very active middle class that actively campaigns for the rights of the poor, both in the rural areas as well as the cities, because of this prolonged interaction. And that is where their cooperation is necessary here, because we need the middle class to do things like pay more taxes and pressure the CCP to help these particular people. We provide the mechanism to do that. They have never engaged with this. Lastly, they have not dealt with Satna State. Under their policy, what we see here is a continual brain drain of the best and the brightest in the rural areas to places like Africa, instead of in China, ladies and gentlemen. If China is to develop, the brains of the best and the brightest, even in the rural areas, must also be exploited to ensure the economic development stays within China. So we actually incentivize economic development. So this brings me to the last and most important point to my heart, the issue of what exactly will the effects of these poor farmers be on this particular city. They say they'll create tension because it's about poor and they cannot open up businesses. On the first level, they have never once dealt with the status quo in this particular village. They say suicide rates will be high in factories. Like Sat say, they're even higher in this particular rural areas, ladies and gentlemen. The more important thing here is that even if the economic conditions were to improve, the politics of envy will increase, because they see people in Beijing and Shanghai being so rich, and politics is always relative here. Their unhappiness will obviously increase. That is why you must create this perception that they are not being discriminated against. On the second level, we think these people can contribute to the economies of this particular city, even if they are uneducated peasants, ladies and gentlemen. The example here that Imran used that they never dealt with is Southeast Asia, in places like California, where the vast majority of Chinese immigrants started out initially as peasants without an education in computing skills, ladies and gentlemen. What they do is they work in the day, then they maybe open a restaurant or eating place at night, and gradually accumulate capital such that their children can go to NUS or Monash and become that is where the Chinese have gone prosperous in Southeast Asia. We think that can happen within China as well. So don't worry about Chinese farmers. We are very resourceful. So lastly, ladies and gentlemen, they say they act as if these people cannot contribute to economic growth. We think on the first level, they increase the labour pool, thus the factories will get more workers. And secondly, when they actually advance themselves, when they open other businesses, these cities will also grow economically as well. And these cities will also be able to accommodate their added capacity, ladies and gentlemen. So even though there may be a bit of tension between the rich and the poor, we think in the long run, their benefit and the effects they will have on these particular cities will outweigh the detriments that they bring. And lastly, even if some rich people will be unhappy, we say they should suck it up. They have been a privileged class for the past 20 years of economic development. It's time they share a part of the economic pie with the most underprivileged people in China, I mean besides Tibet and Xinjiang, of course, ladies and gentlemen. So lastly, I really am embarrassed about how happy I am to fight for this side, because it's truly just. The people living in the rural areas of China deserve this policy, and that is why we propose.
Mr. Speaker, the way the affirmative have talked about China and political incentives operating on them, I almost thought it was a democracy and that people might vote for it in order to create political capital for anything. That is not the way China operates. China does operate on economic incentives and trying to placate its population by providing it with jobs. If all the ideas they had about providing economic benefits were true, that they would be able to provide services, that they would be able to reduce inequality, I think the Chinese government would have done it already. I have 3 questions and 3 things we're going to show that we proved at the end of this debate. The first of that is that there is absolutely no principled entitlement within China to the right to migrate and work in a particular location. We're not stopping people from having businesses, we're just stopping them from doing it in a particular location. Secondly, I'm going to prove that we don't provide for better protection of individuals and individual entitlement. What we heard from Imran's speech at the start of this debate is that everyone in China is entitled to share in wealth, and that is the premise on which it exists. Absolutely. We think you're entitled to share in the wealth of the country as a whole, not entitled to work in a particular location, and that is the distinction that we draw. But moreover, that entire argument was premised on the existence of the economic benefits that they wanted to describe. If they could substantiate the economic benefits, we might be willing to buy into that. We've showed you why they don't exist. I'll tell you moreover. What we told you is that the provision of wealth and the receipt of that wealth is based on the aggregate. And moreover, just to question who the actor is in this debate, they've assumed that the Communist Party would actually be willing to implement this policy itself. We don't think it is. We don't think it's shown a willingness to do that. We talked about the discussion about privatisation in regions like Chongqing and how that was majorly rebuffed in the National Leaders Assembly. We don't think that principle and consistency exists. We think overriding that principle and instituting things like privatisation will only lead to the responses that James talked about, talking about the individuals cracking down on other regions and trying to recreate their base in that way. Moreover, what we told you is that the premise of the collectivisation that exists under China means that if you undermine the principle of privatisation, there's therefore no justification for the redistribution of wealth within the country. So what about those people left behind in the rural communities, Mr. Speaker? We think if most of the majority, which is like 40% of the population, all of a sudden flood into Beijing, if some of those people are left behind, but you no longer have the justification of collective ownership in order to redistribute, it's going to be much harder to tax the populations in Beijing and in Shanghai in order to facilitate that redistribution. So we don't think that's good. What they then told us is that consent is not clear in this country anyway, that there is no implicit consent to the principle that they set up at the start of the debate. We'll go with that. But what we'll tell you moreover is that that's pretty principally inconsistent with your approach, saying that there is enough political capital generated by the protests and stuff that you guys discussed. So we think that if consent, we think that there is ability, disagree. Alright, so lastly, they told us that you obtain dignity by permanence. What they ignored was the very premise in the system under the status quo, which is that of hereditary rights attaching to the hukou system. We don't think the issue in this debate is dignity attached to permanence. We think it's dignity attached to well-being and welfare, which is more important to males in particular in China, and that is how you generate dignity in this situation. Secondly, how do we deal with the press protection of individuals and which system provides that? What they told us is that individuals will move to the city because they get better protection and better provision of services. What we told you more generally is that service provision is incredibly difficult when you have an influx of people into the city. Sasha talked about the issues of overcrowding, about congestion, about access to work. But moreover, what we think we do, statistics have shown that the conversion of people from rural landholders to urban landholders, from the government's perspective, is actually incredibly expensive. The conversion of a few select populations has seen costs of about 30 billion upwards in regions like Chongqing when this method was trialled. What does that mean? It means that the government has less resources available just through the conversion process to be able to transfer over into the provision of services moreover. But it's just physically more realistic that it is easier to build a train line to an area that is rural than it is to build a train line in a country, in a region that is already overpopulated and has buildings in it. Like, where are they physically going to find this land in order to create the services that they wanted to talk about that would all of a sudden be able to provide to 40% more of the population? They also then told us that the CCP only panders to one particular group, which is that in the main cities in Shanghai and Beijing. What I told you in my introduction is that the CCP doesn't pander to any particular group in society. They elect themselves from their own political party. They're not necessarily worried about that. What we told you is that they will act to placate their population, and they will do that in order to by creating economic benefits. Yeah. They then told us that you'll get better engagement between the rural and urban population. Well, first, we kind of reject the idea on two different levels of this. Firstly, we think that relies on mass integration. We think that's problematic if you are suggesting that 40% of your population is moved over. But what we told you throughout our case consistently is that you undermine that engagement when there's a direct and likelihood that these people will not be able to get jobs. You talked about the ability of just being able to people to get businesses and stuff like that. I'll talk about that in a second. What we showed you with Sasha is that when mass migration occurs, like in India, as their second speaker wanted to talk about, you saw the creation of slums that had to be shut down in the Delhi Olympics. We know that this happens. We've seen it happen in the past. We think that's much more realistic on our side of the debate. They also told us that people only commit suicide under the status quo because urban workers don't have protection. No, that's not true. We saw under the trials of privatisation in Chongqing district that there was mass rates of return because of dissatisfaction with the situation in the city. People are not necessarily happier in the city. Moreover, they told us that there is more incentive, in terms of protection of particular groups in the gender divide. What they told us is that there is more incentive for people in the countryside to have boys, and that incentive doesn't work on our side of the house. What we've told you is the fact that the one-child policy existed and led to the creation of 20 million more men in Beijing by 2020. That shows the preference for males that exists in society as a whole. We don't think you can rebut that fact. We think that's still true. We showed you, moreover, that when you have It's just a statistical probability that if you have the option of having 2 more children in many countrysides in the outer regions, that it's statistically more likely that you will have 1 girl as a part of that when you've got more choice available to you than when you have 1 child to bargain on. We told you about the culture that existed in China and about being able to bear fruit to follow on from the family. That was never responded to. Lastly, will this be worse for China? We think it will. Alright, why does this create more inequality? We've actually seen an increase in inequality in China that the government is currently trying to deal with. Why would this undermine that approach? We told you why there's physically no room for it, and that expanding districts in urban areas is much harder than creating cities in rural areas. We told you about the resentment that will build between the richer and between the poorer. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, we think that these individuals are actually the most vulnerable group in this society. They are the people without the skills, and even if you can assert that they might just magically build up these skills over time, we think that it's less likely, and at least in that interim period, you have enough time to entrench that perception that they are less desirable. They then told us that they will be able to create small businesses. We firstly reject the notion that there is enough space in the market and from an economic perspective to do that anyway. But moreover, that is not mutually exclusive with our proposal either. If the Chinese government wants to incentivise urban migration, as they have done in many cases anyway, they can still do that by having control. It's not necessary to privatise the entire system to encourage urban migration. Moreover, even if you're let's deal secondly with the cost of living in this regard. What we told you is that 14% of the population at the moment, 40% of the population are involved in agricultural production at the moment. They've never provided us with an adequate mechanism to show how that food production would be replaced. There's no, as Sam told you, there's no private industry here that can just pick up the slack and respond as quickly as they could in any other country. China is a communist party with heavy state-owned enterprise involvement to the tune of 30%. We don't think they're going to have the flexibility to move in that situation moreover. But lastly, they told us that businesses need access to urban areas in order to develop. I have 4 responses to this. Firstly, the government is capable of doing that now. Secondly, we think the government rules about foreign investment can already block that. We don't think that's absolutely unnecessary given you're undermining their system. We also think cheaper land rental exists in the outer areas, and what a great incentive to other businesses to push them into that area instead of urban regions. What we told you on our side of the house is that they have given no valid justification for the movement of these populations. There's no impetus to begin with at the start of the debate. Moreover, they haven't given us the facilities and shown that these services will be magically created. We showed you it's unrealistic. We showed it's going to harm China. We're very proud to have voted.